Morning, Thabkhe, and good morning, Katrina.
Good
Geshe,
morning.
thank you so much for offering additional teaching. We're overwhelmed and overjoyed and delighted.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, teacher. Yeah, welcome. All of you. You may sit down and you dance on the some daughter commission confidential social. You may sit down and you dance on the song sit down you dance on the. You may sit down by my conscious. Jumba Saja to what to me to the same young and that you can eat a charge a lot. Oh, that didn't matter. Yeah. Oh yeah. I'm going to tell you. And some jet object on door. Can't say you never could danger. Can't say to your child. Teach it all. That your chibet ambitious and Sanju some set on December shoes.
So, good morning to everyone, and thinking that for the sake of all sentient beings, I will attain this state free from all faults and developed in all good qualities. And for that sake, for being able to achieve complete enlightenment, I'm listening to these teachings. So please set a motivation of bodhicitta.
Oh, that's somebody there, Kasher. Chagde Ransing Wilson, I should. That under Talia, Chidamada, Manika, Tangjimba, Chagde, Tachumba, Juji, Tabdi, Tungi, and to combat in Chesek, Mabusheswa, Telia Maris, Pasherva, Taran Susura. On that Chagde Ransing Wilson, that Chagdes and get the condition called S. Ting Wilson Gudua. On that true Laguera, Tangjimba. Chidabatozoke. On a Keratan, a Chalde Kaishin as Takera, Chalde de Kade, Chabate Lam Kade, Chalde Kade, Kandis Sigura. Oh, Tatul Palagan, a touch on Bachuchin essay. Chaldesh in Chuba Indi essay. Touch on Bachuja, Chaldesh in Chuba Indi. Tony? And Chaldesh in Chuba Indi. Ye in a sending you to Chubatas. Touch on Bakorangi. Yes, sort of watching the sending you to go to the Sibuche, Timoshibuche, Dash Kubachin, Suguacha. You enjoy the Megawachi, Conduce, shadows with Tigger Pa, Tupchet, and Yambashi, today you by in the house of Gordo. Oh, when in a sending you to go to what do some 2 Pasha. Tamjala Jesu Chakbada, Konto, Saber Bangbecones, or Konga Yabuchi, some Shenji Chakbada, Tiko, Konduche, Nabachi, sometimes the Konduchi or Maris were no. Chakbada trauma nettogether. She shot on Control Saber Bangbecones, Nyam Yamba Chance, Kunigal Yamba Chiba, some Chiba Mado, Chili Kawa, the Chili Megawa, the Tending and do some Lunashi or Mother. Some Nyamba Chiba is told the order. Nyam Bachan to Tumbe Kibu in Beachera. Oh, Teletachum Basegres. Territalis, Teimbatas. Langja da Torcha, Chagdan Saber Pambe Kibu in Basis. Langjalia, Ralco, Lakbar Chagba. Megubatelia, and Mendeba Toala Soba, Mendeba Shiver so attended. Meba Pambachan Resora. Langja da Torcha, Chagdan Saber Pambe Kibu in Basis. Oh, Teletachum Basegres, that is Sawa in Dilium. Landa Torja Pang Beshes, Langjam Topjata, Torjam Rang Mendu Batazulia, Chagdan Pang Besheres Riora. Tamjela Nyam Yam Chance, or Rally Yaguchin Geshina, Tubuchin Geshikari in Yako, some Yambachem Mado, Chile Chaxi, Kawa, the Chile Megawacha, Tendeo Maris, some Liketo Maris Gora. Tamjela Nyam Yam Chance, Penas, Nyam Yam Kadekors. Tajumba Korangi Church in the Zendengi, Tora, Zenden two Tongbalas, Zendengi, the good court machine between the Chugwana, Dash Kubache, Chidri and Megawache, two shot, Tigger, and Yambache, Chunju Tomnia, Gang in nature, Kachere. tini tsungpa se chakde shini chiba delia ane chakpa na tongchoga menge dikyu menge kansa dele chakde sigiri zawa diyunguda o dishkyuna.
So here we are picking up then from the third point, which is on 452 in Roger Jackson's translation. So this is identifying the nature of detachment. So we've seen these other schools like the Vaisheshikas and the Samkhyas assert that we can attain, or one could attain, a state of detachment, of being free from attachment by just meditating on suffering and so forth. And we've said in response that that isn't actually a state of detachment, just the simple meditation on suffering and so forth. And so they ask, well, what is the nature of that detachment that you speak of? And how is it that you achieve such detachment? So the opponent, beginning on 453, says, well, then according to you, what is detachment? And Gyaltsab-je, we respond then, well, an arhat is said to be detached because they are a person who has gained equanimity through utterly abandoning attachment and anger in all cases. So here, this idea of detachment is illustrated by the example of someone who, an arhat, who is detached because of the fact that they've gained equanimity. It is the same whether they are respectfully anointed with sandal paste or cut by an axe. So if there's a person who, say, on their right side, they have someone respectfully rubbing them with sandalwood oil and giving them a nice massage, and then on the other side, there's someone with a knife cutting off chunks of their flesh, this arhat would not give rise to any kind of feeling of attachment or liking for one person and a kind of disliking or hatred for the other person. They've achieved this state of equanimity where they don't, they've abandoned attachment and anger in all cases, even that extreme of having someone that's like giving them a massage with sandal paste and someone cutting their flesh off on the other side. So here it follows that this is so because they are a person who has utterly abandoned attachment to what is to be adopted and what is to be rejected. Here, in the sense of what is to be adopted, the objects of our attachment, those things that we want, and what is to be rejected are the things that we don't want. And so as it explains again in the root verse of this, one is said to be detached when one has gained equanimity in all cases. So one feels this sense of equanimity toward all beings, regardless of what they might be doing to you. You aren't giving rise to attachment to some and anger toward others. It is the same whether one is anointed by sandal or struck by an axe, because one has abandoned what is to be adopted and what is to be rejected. So here, there's no attachment towards those things that one wants or aversion toward things that one doesn't want. And in this way, this state of equanimity is free from attachment or aversion.
Oh yeah. Oh, that is Kasura. Marazu Tandarishini couldn't do your membership or the Marazu Lulia Shacha Yore. So they were the Tungelia Bay. Tobata Torture Samlo Chagdan Suksabu. The young members of Yinako, Dame, Kibun Dringi, Samju Korande, Taksho and Shencho, Chagdan Pona at the Zorova. Tagbe Shenche, but the Chitugo Martina, Semgelia, Rancho, the Shencho Meva, Chagdan Pong, Lamzo, some Tangiora, or the Indico Casoda. Tende come near it, Dame, Ta, some Tongue when you come, Rangu to it, Dame, Tongue when you come. Oh, tende chidung anju neshi samlu ti tegi omarto. Ti samlu tegi omare. Chitane ko chutamje tawadwe tingi jisero tende komse duza ganga dewe nawara shache paji tebe ko sunga keji marta paji tebe ka suya langbu tende susu jibe ina ko dewe sawara chike amado tungi meji ba tende yongdi doga. Oh, ti indi ko karsura. Chawadi kegi omarta be anju neshi kiti sonda. Chidangarazu Kondre Sebina, Chida Milia, Kondro Jeje, Tichidone, Mare Jesho, Dagri, Captured Zambe, Chu Sanjet to the Pona, Nazakadul Haku Mare, Pesos of Budatova, Trat and Kamalu Senatanda Kotuze, Pazuti Capti Jackson Dodua. Gay the Shuk Sedara Cheneko, Kadudilia, Sanjay to be Toa Tungaki, Sorny out and the most stay your mother. That on the Kajan songs is called John the Trontura. Sako Kondo Tantide Wangeko, Tungation the Seeking and what in the Zako, Chamba Church in the Chamba Tangi, Semi Orton, Tachamba to the land. Chamba Tangi, Sinja Kanga Josh, come to Ral never Chena, Papa Jotel, Harbor Tomato. Tingomaro, Paju, Zawadi, some succeed and call never that in the assembly of Guamarto, and it's the relation Marto. Or tendency to the young to good is Comna, to the young Sibarangarazin, and that some down in a young Missibari to or teach you Kuna.
So, as we are right now, this seems like this might not be able to come about. It's like we have a great desire, a kind of clinging attachment to our body and the things that benefit us, the things that we're attached to, and we have great aversion toward those things that we see as harmful. So, this might seem like something that couldn't come about or won't come about. But we see that even for those who are practicing on the middling scope, that toward others, they give up that sense of attachment and anger. We're able to see that even those that are not fully on the Mahayana, they are trying to get rid of having a kind of attachment toward some and anger toward others. So they then, by meditating on selflessness, by meditating on emptiness, are able to change that way of thinking, the way that we normally kind of think. So even within the sutra teachings, we see that this isn't sort of talking about tantra. We see that there are meditations where everything is perceived as bliss. You no longer are getting sort of harmful feelings from the environment, but you're able to have everything arise in a kind of pleasurable nature. So we can see that generally when we give, like right now, the way that we are, when we give rise to anger and we engage in fighting with people and say we even get like stabbed by a weapon of some kind, we know the kind of pain and suffering that that brings about to have those kinds of negative, afflictive emotions. And so that's our current way of thinking and being, but we are able to transform that by developing attitudes of love and compassion, by developing the immeasurables and so forth. We can come to a place where even when someone does cause us harm, we won't think of that harm, but rather will view that being with an extra kind of love. And so even though this seems like something that might be impossible, we should recognize that it's not impossible, even for those beings on the middling path, to be able to develop this sense of emptiness and selflessness leads to a place where we get rid of that way of thinking.
Oh, yeah. That's what to me, Comba, Sumba, and give up on Bassota. That's it about any day, Tanzamba to love you. Tacheranga joke choa dunge kombade tunge kombade trela means labdelia no kapa cheche mambu che soase. Ta na kera chena tunge komba sungba dan gewa pamba ne sanje chomde de do kapso tambu da tini tunge komgure sindene tunge phabe tamba ose tene tunge komba song doase ane te dan gel soase ta kera o tisi do ona chomde de tunge komba sungba chidari shena ase Sanji chumde de tunge komgure sonso ate kande de ese kira tunge kombate tolam mare ese ngazur kakba che sonsi yordo tunge samla konne songba mai de so tunge komba songba de ene tande kondo kenzu sheba na shingi so tunge de sangma ge hakoye tunge chora tondu yanje hakoye tunge sigra o ti she yordo kondo tunge jure tawa dele ya tunge jure tunge sigi wa mare keban doji gi tunge se le da nyuma ba ge rawa me ba lang go be phungbu tele tunge sigi wa mara tanang ba chena tunge se de tunge choa tunge janja mare tunge wa singe tele tunge wa asigora sakje nyele ji phungbu koranda choa diru tanyo sumna ne tunge de marwa ina te tunge wa sigi tunge wa re tunge kinge tele sigi wa no o te sanje chumde de tunge komba songbate kondo tene sheba chenzo sheba na shinge so tunge ti tanja komba la songi o mare se chidan ti chire do tunge samla kone te kongure songi o mare ane karesana siba tada ke yin chungwe chedo keban doji ki tungele kone tunghe kombar sungpares siba tada liya nye song ta tendo ta leda nyomo bawange rawa meba pungbu dolin che kwebe siba mkoa tele ya nyeban chungwe ke tundala tele tanda shenja yueba de shenja de tsun doa ne nginjung ki ya ke tundala sungi ordo siba tada ke yin chungwe chedo keban doji ki 동해를 꺼내서 캐반 두시기 동에 감성발을 캐봐 좋아 레다니 뭐 시험하도 전에 랑쿠베 풍부됐어라 캐반 두시 동에서 코아바 탐절 캐고로 동해디 강갈 캐고 말해 교회 동해디 강갈 캐고 말해 삼대 다 송미도 또야 말도 소아때와도 말 땅좀 잡아도 말 어딘데 시바타다게 예조에서도 캐반 두시기 동해를 꺼내 동해 공부를 송바이 매체스 티 코아 타달랑에 중께 전달이야 레니 샤와장기 풍부스 텔레동에 레다 영업에 라와 샤와제데 소설 라와요 말에 기질에서 어디 공부를 쓴 거래서 네게 동에 대한 수제에서 그다를 딱발할 때 봐마이도 대답이 캐번 도시기 동에 남바가 셔야 대한수요로 그다를 딱박이 제 텔레템바게 아니 레니 지왕게 저 풍부를 쓰여 말해서 라디오 레니 겐레 케베셔서 때 랑게 주진레 때니 케베 미닥바레서 다야 미닥바레 저니 동해도 미닥바 임버와 저리 따지 싸워데 두치 동해 라고네 동해 공바송 바 인스티레 대하고다 개반 두지 동해 공바를 거네 시바 타달이야 니중케 약던달이야 전에 동해 공바송 바데 초 동해 동해 장자 공바송 비어 말해서 동해 공바송 바 내게 대한 깨래 깨서 대답이네 개반 두지 동해 대야 미다바레서 다들 템베 다디야 미다바레 마도 견주 도바나시 다다바 되고 말해서 거라 내게 대한 깨래 깨서 내게 개반 두지 동해서야 대야 아니 계란에서 하는 딱발을 때 맞지 말해서 다 미다바 주진을 깨네 깨바다 코란 주진을 깨바 호텔 때 말해서 어디시구나
So here, then, the next point is disposing of the idea that our position contradicts the Buddha's teaching on the meditation on suffering. So again, we have been refuting the Vaisheshikas and the Samkhyas who say that there is a path to liberation through just meditating on suffering, and in particular the suffering of suffering. And so they say, well, if you're asserting that such meditation on suffering is not a path to liberation, then doesn't that contradict the Buddha's teachings? The Buddha taught this is the noble truth of suffering and so forth, and one should come to know that. And so is there not a contradiction? And so the opponent says, well, then how is it that the Blessed One taught the meditation on suffering? So here, the response then comes, he did not teach it with only the suffering of suffering in mind, because he taught the meditation on suffering for the sake of renunciation of a samsaric existence, with the pervasive suffering of the formations in mind. So when the Buddha spoke about suffering, it wasn't just with the idea of the suffering of suffering, that the thing that everyone, even animals, can recognize as suffering. That's not what he was talking about solely, but rather it was taught the truth of suffering and the meditation on suffering with the suffering of pervasive conditioning or the pervasive formations in mind. And so the kind of suffering that one needs to meditate on is recognizing that these aggregates, which get taken up due to the force of karma and the afflictions, are suffering, these contaminated suffering aggregates. And so this kind of suffering pervades all of samsaric existence, from the lower realms to the upper realms. So it is this process of casting off and taking up contaminated aggregates due to the force of karma and the afflictions that one experiences the sufferings of samsara. So this pervasive suffering of existence, or the sufferings of the formation, is something that occurs for all three realms, because we don't see, for example, in the formless realms and higher concentrations, obvious suffering. There's only a kind of neutral feeling. But that existence too is subject to this suffering of pervasive formations, and that these aggregates, even those aggregates, are taken up under the power of karma and the afflictions. And also, that suffering pervading our formations or pervading these aggregates is not based on a permanent self, because it arises from its own causes and defiled conditions. So, again, this kind of suffering of pervasive existence does not apply to any kind of a permanent self, because, again, this arises from its own causes and conditions. So, the root verse then reads, "The Blessed One taught the meditation on suffering with the suffering of formations in mind. Also, that suffering pervading our formations arises from conditions." So again, couldn't apply to some kind of a permanent self.
Oh yeah. Nangarazu nangbala ko tunge komba ya so yetu yordo. Nyawa yita tendreli kesone tunge tende yore sidi chatangi tunge da sekba da tokba da tende tunge she yora. Oh tezu komba de ngara deli kesone tunge tende nyongore samsa te chedo ne komgi yore. Eni ya semje shendali ya chawa kibe chedo ya. Nyewe tunge yita tunge tende tunge da sule tunge yune tunge kombe kapdo yora. Chida komko yordo, kombe yordo. Tanda deli ya dini dunga pakwa tenpa koa tatalia nyepan junga chido dunga kongkure sungura. Oti lenyo je xiangwa chengi. Lenyo je xiangwa chengi chinche tila kokaya yongsi barito. Ngone samla tanga shengi tsoke dunga sungi nane kepan duji ki dunga di dushi chigore. Soso le rawa meba, soso le ngenpa sa kidi gile re sa te xiangwa dukyu ne 풍부 돌린 세지 제거바 겨라 양시 야튼데 제거바 뜻도가 통고요래 단다 초아 동에도 이바래 대인데 코 지야 용시 버려도 대인데 단다 가도 들이야 동에 공부 송바데 동에기 초아 동에기 동에 매게 매베 삼대다 송미 삼대시요도 송미시요도 근데 내가 대도 상마 내년지 샤와제 간가 대줄이야 이 중에 치도 현재 반에 팀에 서고도 삼자 대에 치도 아니 동해지 동해 공부 송배 동해디 개번 두시 동해들의 송교하라 어디줄람나
So we're also taught then to meditate on the suffering of suffering, or there are times when we do think about those kinds of sufferings, like, for example, being born in the hell realms and experiencing the sufferings of hot and cold and so forth, or the sufferings of hunger and thirst. Thinking about the kind of sufferings of those various rebirths in order to give rise to a thought of not wanting to be born there, recognizing that if we create the kind of causes, we could end up in such a suffering sort of a situation. But when the Buddha taught this is the noble truth of suffering, it was really about the suffering of pervasive formations, or the suffering pervading our formations, in that everything that is under the control of karma and the afflictions is in the nature of suffering. When we are in the control of those, we have no autonomy. We do certain actions. If we do bad actions, we are going to experience the suffering results of those. And so here, when we are thinking about this, we should be recognizing not just the sort of suffering feelings, but that which pervades all of the realms, like even into the meditative concentrations, they are still under the control of karma and the afflictions. So in order to give rise to renunciation of wanting to get out of that cycle, this is what is taught. And so therefore we need to reflect on that suffering of pervasive conditioning that applies to all realms, all births within samsara.
Oh yeah. 다 텐데 동에 공별로 대한 출신에서도 개번 두지기 동에 드니 동에 박배 템바오스 동에 공고래서 감송별 송교하라 대대비 동해 공별로 대해서 개번 두지기 동해 공별로 들어 대대비 동해 공별로 대체 시발에 되게 람도 되봐야 많이 돼서 어디 시발에 키라도 동해지 동해 공바데 코알레 트제게 람이 시도 아티나시 개번 두지기 동해 공별로 대야 시발에 뭐서 트제게 람이 메산에 송바 말해서 그러도 저는 뭐서 트에 lamdon debaya mayindese tami tokbe tawa kebe tenam taptamba imbese tami tokbe tenam taptamba leda nyumbe shawado jure de kadis jurgresna nga samsa nga jishuk chembeke ti wange ni chagdang wange kidigile sane ni ko rame ba korte yores ti shegora ti tongya ware shegora ti de tami tokbe tawa de kebe tenam taptamba imbese tami tokbe tawa koala nginjo komchade tadi meba kande sogreso te tawa de dangjin tere te meba sogorese tami tokbe tawa de keya tondalia te tablia tambo shemba loye tondalia kamsunga rawa meba kewa tele shemba lone tele tarwa chego do sam tadi jugareso ni tami tokbe tawa keya te tondala songyor mado tungi gomba korande sibale ngoso tujik lami bechane songyor mare segodwa o sibale ngoso tuwe lammeya tedar kom kodese o tunge kom belo te sibale ngoso tujik lammeya kom kodese karesna ora ale tambu te chilamna kamera ya te chilamna mambo chimeta.
So then it continues in the commentary saying, also, that mind that meditates on suffering like that. So again, here, this is not just meditating on the suffering of suffering, but rather the suffering of pervading formations, the suffering that applies to all three realms that was taught when the Buddha taught this is the truth of suffering and so forth. But this is not asserted to be a path that directly frees one from samsaric existence, because freedom has as its basis or highest method the generation of the view that realizes no self. So here again, this mind that meditates on the suffering of pervasive conditioning or that pervades formations is such that one meditates on the process by which being under the control of karma and the afflictions, that this is the source of all suffering that we experience. And so recognizing that it is due to the thought of self-grasping that one engages in various afflictions and accumulates karma, and thus without any kind of autonomy takes rebirth, we recognize that the root of that is self-grasping. And so the meditation on suffering itself is not the path that directly frees one from samsaric existence, because the path that directly frees one is that realization of no self. That is what is able to get at that root of grasping at a self. But this meditation on suffering kind of leads to the necessity of generating that view of no self by reflecting on the process of suffering.
Oh yeah, so the dirwa tene tammi tade yinsinga dirwa tungewa kombate kura twelam ngo marite te tamebe tawa togbe shirab de kebe chedo ane kowa tadala ngeban jongyo warese te cheb songora tene tammi tade yinsinga dirwa ta chawa to dilamna.
So then the root verse to this then says, meditation on it has as its basis the view of no self. So one engages in a meditation on the suffering of pervasive conditioning in order to be able to realize, or for the sake of generating that view, realizing no self.
Oh, sta sibale ngo soto lammeya keban doji gitunge kombate sibale ngo soto lamma ina yange badu komgo resi waro karesna tongi tobe tawa kombe sibale ngo so tawara jula sibale ngo so tawara singete da mebe tongbani tokbe lote resi koe tawa de tadun zimbade sonza di mebe soya gitene tami tokbe sirabde koale ngo so chege lamde resi komba langma duje mida badas langma kombe lama mida so chudu nane langma songyo do deshi mida so chudu nane tunge dembalia mida tunge towa dami shi songyo ba tine shi kunju de kangal naba shi yo do so komba lama duje mida bar to badas duje tamje mida bada to batewa tunge dembe de samlta mida bada chi samlta ba ene tunge wa samlta yo do komba lama Duce Mitabar talk about Sakje Dunga to talk about Sakje Yelenji Pombu Tunga to talk about Tungawa talk about Tungin Jung Shi, but talk about the Tungawa Score. Tami talk by Shirab Te, Tabjiton to never come go vessels. Tami talk by Shirab, take a Tabjiton to never to Tungawa to come go grace on Gora. Tungi Tawe Tranger to Combalama te doing inside it. Tongba talk by Dami talk by Lamde, Trolamone, take to do this. And then Duce Medabada, Tunga Combasung to a take Arsena, Combalama to Tongi talk by Tawa Kebe Cheto, Titon to Songuares. Koala Tungaji Ranction to Tone Teletandu Magina, and it take you carry Statue Sigmarwa. I tend to unit you carry something, you the members over some door, the members were tapped, Tongi to be sure of this, some Hako to be or Zawadi, Tony Tower to your Combalama to do is what is gonna.
So even though, picking up in the commentary, it is also necessarily the case that the meditation on suffering is not the path that directly frees one from samsaric existence, because one is directly freed from samsaric existence by accustoming the view that realizes voidness. So here again, even though this meditation on the suffering of suffering pervading the formations, or the suffering of conditioned existence, is not the actual path to liberation, it's what generates renunciation for samsara. And once one realizes the situation of samsara as suffering and looks for the root of that, well, what is the fundamental cause, and sees that that cause, that root, is grasping at a self, this apprehension of a self, then one will develop that realization of selflessness or voidness. And so because the remaining meditations, realizing composites to be impermanent and realizing contaminated phenomena to be suffering, are necessarily contemplated for the purpose of affecting that wisdom realizing no self. Thus, the reason the Blessed One, so here, the remaining meditation. So when we contemplate the truth of suffering, there is the various components of that, recognizing that all composites are impermanent, and that that which is contaminated is suffering, and that which is, and then that all contaminated phenomena are suffering, and then all phenomena are without some kind of a self. So it's in order to generate that realization of selflessness that one engages in these remaining meditations, or the various sort of contemplations that go with the Four Noble Truths. So it's in order for the purpose of generating that wisdom, realizing emptiness, that one needs to contemplate that all things are impermanent. And as such, because they are impermanent, they are contaminated or in the nature of suffering. And recognizing that suffering nature, we then look at, well, what's the causality? And by identifying that cause, we then develop that view of voidness. So again, in the root, it says, one is freed by the view of voidness. The remaining meditations are for the purpose of that.
Oh, yeah. Oh, Tena Chomdendegi, Duce Mitabar talk bale, Saje Dunga to talk about us. Tunga Tembe number she soon to some Mitaba, Tunga, Dami she soon go. Tambu de Mitaba Combure Songuardo. Saje Yele Pombu Mitaba Combures. Teacher Mitale, Tunga, Keji Jibe, Nelly Lonzola Sopan to Kanga Mitaba. Mitaba Yende, Tunga Vares, Mitaba Sonja, Yagachina, Jure Sujanaba, Tanda, Mi Javarajala, Yagachina, Conjune, Yashanda, Dugadil Dosagrido, or Tindico, Leda Newman by Shama, the Jurbe Sakje, Luta Neto Lujo to Kanga, Mitaba Jura Situsa, anything they led a Newman Bewange, Shama Jerete Auto, teaching Medale Tungas, Tunga Sonja. Pumbunga Dira, Keji Jura Medaba, Tia Leda Yamaba on the Shawacha to Tuning Judan Gayinde, and Teliane, Rama Tachi Yongmares, Tame Bashayoto, Metatunge Tomas, Rama Ta, Tenshan Yongmar Tombas, Any round ta Pumbutan or Chiban Buddhist Yungumar Tame Basungo or Tatunda. Tenechum then they induce metabar talk ballet, subject to talk about. Subject to talk ballet, subject to Sakwas to Yamol Siwara. Yamon Bewang is Choe Pumbutula, subject Pumbusiora. Subject to talk about us. Tungedo talk ballet, time about talk about Sumbe, you say you days. Metaba totine, tunge to talk balletine, tame talk about it, tame tony to talk yodo. Narishebe, tapson tedder never song basis, this on the tambo metaba combore, tene, tunge combore, tene, tini, no comchadusa, tendon, take you caresse, and then tangere, timber so a tap caresse, tame respond to mini the shavers. Narishebe tapjon tedder neba, sungba teachers, dole sonse shagre. Kelonda su takba yina, mitaba yinsa, Naranzuli suji pumbu sembe, and su migatoya to Sama Tamjete, takbare than midabare sungurdo. Sumba midaba la sosi yashina, de midabare, so sobores than midabare yashurdo. Come midaba de dungawa yinam, dewa yinsu. Come midaba yin sobo, midaba yin bade, dungawa da teware sodo, dungawa la sosa. Tanda de Jurja Karkari Tende Yamato, Koyania Gorva, Tanda Naman and now you Tanda Shimena Shido, Karkar Jundru, Karin Judu, Tende Yamara. Can you come with about the Dungawa Yenam Devayas, Tandangazu Kwa Kongangi? Ne Longula Soba Desert Sungura. Desert time George the Yaga the Duga, Tenipa Judu, but the Sanje. Tuju Namji Medaba, Tunga, the Tendesha Yamara. Metaba in a Tunga being ever Kamato. Sanje and it's to Shingamta, to Metaba de Tunga in Sigmardo, Tandangarazo. Ko Dang Garazo so good as same that the Zushi and the Sungurdo. The uncle led and your mobile ten a ko Dangangi. Many little to Metabara, Metaba Sonja, Tunga station, Digora, Tisha and Sungurdo. Sumba Metaba la sauce, come Metaba de Dunga in them Devaye, Sumba Dunga la sauce. Come Metaba de Dunga, number you Sujan la sauce, come Metaba de Yagachina, Georgia, Duare Dula Soba tended the patching the city to Georgia, tended tank a Sajire Sungora. Come Metaba de Dunga, you Sujan la sauce. Tell Andines. Or tendes, Sergeant Yelenge Pumbula Sobateda, Metaba, Dunga, and then Mezawa Sobatendere. Tell you, sometimes I look Shambucheda, Nae, some Shida, Shida, Sajire, Dugasungura. Oh, Dingones and the Megura Redoda, Tungaji Shitin Gedora, Ral Tungatangas Redordo, Sateli Shanjachi, or Marisungura. Tell Andinin Naeosa, Denny. Then I know, and I guess, Shanjasu Chambuchak, the Meduasungura. Then a dago, shake the dardo, rungams, then there's some time they dig the Dugasungura. Sumba Malaso, so they dream those Rungumares, Suksambut and the summertime, the Rungumares and Guada. She so oh, yeah, Tadi, Zawad, Singam Dolamna. Teaching medale, Dungel and Tamis, Setera. Teacher Tambu Midabasura, Midabasu, Medale Imbalatene, Pumbude, Nitonga, language Shamachi Midaba in Bichisigodo. Oh, teachers only don't damage the Sungura. Teaching medale, Tungel and Tamis, Tandi Samlutandi, Tambu Midaba Samluta, Tine Dunga Samlutara. And Tunga Jatsos or Tadi Abu Never say Guyuna Manas and then Q Samlutangra. Q Tadu Zimba Hakoson and all Tadu Zimba de Zimbanashi, Tame Bada, Tonga Dame Race, Tadi Pumbuda, Rao Chief to Truba, the Tade to Truba Mares, Kumjuza, Chema Meda Tungani to come to Kunjung to come. Kunjung Chelia, Tinyambudene. Tami to we Sirabi Combu, the Tidus and Tonga Tami to Yongo to Comdusa. That continue. Yeah, that. Oh, this is Duna, teaching me Duna. This one. Oh, yeah.
So here, when it comes then to the reason for this kind of teaching, thus the reason for the reason the Blessed One taught that from the realization of composites as impermanent originates realization of contaminated phenomena as suffering. And from that realization of suffering originates the realization of no self, is because, just as explained, he taught that the method and the result of the method exist thus. So here, when it comes to the four aspects of the truth of the suffering, that it is impermanent, suffering, selfless, and empty, it is taught in a particular order that because phenomena are impermanent, they are therefore suffering. So here, when we think about that, we can recognize that even if, say, right now we have a good rebirth or we have good enjoyments and so forth, those are not things that are permanent. They are not going to remain. So we have taken a good rebirth right now, but we could fall into a lower rebirth in the future. And when we look at the kind of suffering process, we recognize that all of this arises from karma and the afflictions, that we have taken up these five aggregates due to the force of karma and the afflictions, and continue to cycle in samsara. So it is then thinking about that kind of impermanence that leads to an understanding of suffering, and in turn recognizing that suffering and looking for the root of that. Well, we grasp that there being some kind of a self, but really the aggregates, this sort of when we look for such a self, we recognize that they are lacking any kind of a self. So here, when it comes to these contaminated aggregates, if we look at them and recognize that they are impermanent, and then by that realize that they are in the nature of suffering, we can then come to realize that they are selfless. They lack any kind of a self that in the way that it appears to us, and then from that realize emptiness. In this context, the sort of emptiness and selflessness have slightly different connotations depending on where those aspects are being described. But so when one then looks at this, and here there is a quotation from the sutra. It says, according to the sutra, the Buddha says, "Oh, monks, is form permanent or is it impermanent?" And they respond, "It is impermanent, Lord." And so here, when we are talking about the kind of things that are impermanent, it's not necessarily the case. Here, when we're talking about form in this quotation, this is referring to the kind of aggregates that we have, this form aggregate that we have right now. And so whatever is impermanent then, and in the sense of impermanent as in within samsara, those things that are, say, for example, when we are right now, we might not be sick, but we are sort of we could always be on the verge of being sick. We have not yet died, but we are moving towards that kind of death. And so that which is impermanent, and in particular, that which is driven by karma and the afflictions, is going to be suffering. It's not something that is pleasurable. And so all that we enjoy, all of the kinds of things that we consider to be a component of the self are in this nature. But when we say that it's not the case that everything that is impermanent is suffering. For example, the continuum of a Buddha, that's impermanent, but not in the nature of suffering. Or we could talk about the Pure Lands, and those also are impermanent, but not in the nature of suffering. But we're talking here about the kind of impermanence that applies to the six realms of beings within samsara, and these contaminated aggregates that are necessarily impermanent in the nature of suffering and impure. So we have this sense of like, well, this thought of I is necessary. This thought of a self is something that is helping me. But when we begin to investigate this process, we see that actually that sense of self, that grasping at itself, is what is suffering, or what is the cause of our suffering. So those things that are under the control of our karma and afflictions are going to be in the nature of suffering. So here this quotation continues by saying that is what is impermanent suffering, or is it happiness? It is suffering, Lord, and what is impermanent has the nature of changing to suffering. So again, even if we're not currently suffering, we could be on the verge of suffering. That's always the case within samsara. And so then it continues saying, is it proper to say of that, this is mine, this is I, or this is myself? And they respond, it is not, Lord. So here, when we are able to recognize that the cause of all of this suffering is holding to some kind of a self or an I. So again, when we're actually doing these meditations, we go through the truth of suffering and then to the origin of suffering. What is the cause that propels us to take rebirth within samsara, and then contemplate, well, what is the antidote to that? And this is the point at which we then develop the understanding of selflessness by looking at, well, could such an autonomous self exist as the same as my aggregates or different from my aggregates? And in that way, we begin to investigate the understanding of selflessness. And so again, it proceeds in a particular progression, as the root verse says. Thus, the Blessed One taught that from impermanence comes suffering, and from suffering, no self.
Oh yeah. Da kurim dedar ngebe jusenese mida dunge to dame tande so sungero. Kurim dedar ngebe jusene dunge mida bar tokbe la chelese dunge ji phungbudi mida bar tokbe la chele tene sungero. Dunge ji phungbudi tokbe la tene se tiwange kari ngurisena. Randunge tatukbe yitendu roa 차이만 도바실라스 소소고 전다 야가르지 대원듭시네 란데기 타르투바로 소소전다 약수듯이 이 땅두로와 때 야가르지 밀루르지 톱베 내르로지 강가 표준 속바요나 집에 이대로와르지 딱바르스 투스탱게 소르지 이시여바르 투스테 소르 삼루요르도 어디 이대로로에 로디바도요레스 미다바 콤소나 기타바 데그마르다 송거라 이den도 로에 차이 받은 독바치그레스 디메브샤그레 상제 동에도 독발에 인존된 바치도 상제지 감숨가게 레다 녀모베 사과 녀모바다 데레산에 랑쿠베 풍부치 신제들 정말 동에게랑 신제레 송소나 송바데 송발에 텐데나시 곰바이나 삼르다나 상제 동에도 곰베 인존된 바치도 다데 야부데메도 아삼 퀄리티 신제들이야 동해세지 냐네 대공개치대도 아섬 이ing에만 봐 도나 매밤이야 이 신지 차대요래 야부인 섬들게 돼서 텔레수 이준이 심발로에 전달을 송거라 어디지 그러나 주나 인준 좀 버세 어
So then the next point is the reason for ascertaining the ordering thus, that it's certain the order goes in this way. So in the wake of the realization of the suffering composites as impermanent, one turns away from the idea that those composites are ultimately reliable for the accomplishment of one's own aims. So even if we say have a good body right now with all kinds of good conditions, this is not something that is ultimately reliable. We can't count on that because they are permanent. And so in that way, one recognizes that from again in the wake of the realization of the suffering composites as impermanent, like say the body that we have right now, one gives rise to a kind of renunciation or turns away from the idea that these are reliable for the accomplishment of one's own aims. And the realization of contaminated phenomena as suffering induces a renounced mind. So here, again, by thinking about this and recognizing, oh, this isn't good from the point of taking rebirth in samsara due to karma and afflictions and going to experience these sufferings, one then gives rise to a kind of renunciation, a wish to get out of that.
Oh yeah. 근데 보세요. 당가르 다게 대와 톱자르 짐바다. 당봉에 리아는 로산지가 나리아. 소소 대와도 내려 로지 표심 속바 대외 시든도 강가 톱자 삼기로와 고기 삼상게 샴바요레. 대 딱바르 짐바 니 속발에서 대베 딱바르 스틴데 땡게 삼로시. Tenjaje Tangerichi Mato, T. Shaja Kangashan, Drogo Samson, Samlu Kogumato, Namjune. Inshasha dus two stairs, 2000, Tangeng Samrish Kurpiore. Nare Tagi Tawa Topsar Zimbata, Te Tabar Zimbani Chokbala Tene Sara, Tag Pusum Chokba Teve Shirip Tuskanga, Tagban Zini. Tini Chokbala Tene. Tawa de Jurmi, Yitan Duru Venesun Zimbaya. Nelly Longi Pusum Chokba Tavaras, Yide Rungerich, Sembe. Location get to stay in some sort of chiva, or Titande or Marin Judong, some Gimaro, or Tita Tajar is taking in some sort of Samliora, Yitan Duroa, Ishi says or to stay in be some Lushishachi, do the matter, Tita Tende or Marin Jewish, some Gimara. Tawat in Jurmiji, Yitan Durove, Yiden says of what Simba, Nessun Zimbadi or Esse. That Tawati Namida Bartovana today, Tawata Teve Shila Sobatu Kanga, oh, Jura de Jigbe Chusare, then to take a mare, Situ, Soso da China, then to meet me near Lojula Sobatu launching and do staging in some of the Yona, because some of the Chapel is doa. Attended Tange Mare Samna, and some of those Gasser could do it. Marazuchi Neris and Dongayana, Tanga Dogres and Juba in Samina, Shera Samlu Cheshi Marwa, Duzi Seje, Doya Cheshi Sepi, Dosadi Samlu Tangra. The many danger was taking some Nico de Shisha Mother, Doya Samlu Kogumardo. Oh, the next one. Tawadin Namida Bartovana. Tingi Tungejo London Barcedo, and Tunga Ranshin Bachikoshida Yichi Maba. Tijela Doga di Yonesa Kodunga Ransichire to us, Tungi in Junkunchire to us, Tia Condora, Tunga was a tira. Young come gome, Bidivaja. Ta come goma does a sungam da sumi di Kamasagorno. O Tezolia Tungi Soa Tungeji Tungeta, Jure Tava Saxmatu Tava said to Zuta di Yomar Marsalia. So a tanium janja di Achigora. Chidango Tanium di Soa di Nene Yagarachiri Dora. Cacho do Sojoine, Cabo Tava Sona, anything you need to do the 10 day marto. Anything do some dimas or some Soa Dungegi Narones, Soa Deva Sasa, Soa Deva Deving Azul Mangadunga Tegare. Or Tayabu should so some anything called Jurg Dura Degmarto. Tenia the Kanga Gora, Tungete Yordo. The come Gomal Tinga di Omada. They look Cabanduzi Dunga said you are Lanuji Shawaz and Dunga. Oh, there's only Junia Delia. Come come, Sajaki things in us, things in temple or Kevin and Kevin about to tell to it in the order. Some day she better. Oh, Tezo Randuna Kimba and Nado Shiba that you enjoy the look on out. Tezola. Kangben member and a sitinal tender, Mabana single look go, Tezole, Yaban Jongo, or Teliat and a time without what's never talk. Tagichidang had Zumidabo sometimes, Rakwe Midabo sometime, or Chua Midabas, 10 to 10 game Maris, and Residu Rakbari de Orno. Taking a Saba Kunji Tajes, Tombonam Tatundu. Dube Tama Trava, the Kira Tamachu and said the Rabbi Midaba Sungua, Saba Tama, the Sergeant Red Dasa, Sabatan, Tombo Tayaga, Johnsonati, Tadi Guba, Dube Dasa, Tombona Tabdas, Dus and Yamdo, Yadula Soba, Ruruche, Pusun Soba, United Kaga, Red Dasa, Dube Tama Trava, Kesa Dus and Chia Redasa, Chida Rabade Sungura, Tinga Randu Chida, Miss Samatan, Tiaga. I let Tavi much the Machunaya. That didn't do that under the Sungmi that the Tuli in Jongalaya, Ragbe Mida the Timara, Tavi Mida was some tongue with Resungura. Now the Suba W in Jungi Lokiwana, Tavi Mida Toba, Langiber Toko, so what about the Chituna?
So here, then again, when we have this kind of grasping at things as being permanent, as well as grasping at something as being sort of pure or happy, we have this thought of like desiring the self. We don't have a kind of renunciation. So here it says, formerly, from the combination of grasping at the happiness of self as obtainable and grasping at it as permanent, one grasped at the happiness as unalterably reliable. So we usually sort of regard our abode, our body, the enjoyment that we have, the possessions and things. We regard those due to this innate kind of grasping at them as permanent, as though we can have confidence in them. We don't normally think of them as being changeable or alterable. We don't think, oh, this is perishable. This isn't going to last a long time. We all tend to have this strong idea like, oh, I'm going to remain forever. These things that I have are going to remain. And so from the coming together of this grasping at the happiness of the self as obtainable and grasping at it as permanent, like this is something that I can attain and it will remain, we engage in this kind of sense that these are unalterably reliable, that we can have a confidence in them. But this then is something that we are able to undermine when one realizes that happiness is impermanent and the realization induces a suffering mind. We recognize that all of these things that we perceive as being somehow stable and lasting are not actually that way, but rather they are impermanent. This induces a suffering mind, or we generate a sense of renunciation. And that is not something that just applies to feelings of suffering or even that kind of contaminated happiness that is the suffering of change, but also in the samadhi on the contamination of the upper realms. There arises a renounced mind that sees birth in the upper realms as like entering into a burning house. This definitely depends on the prior realization of subtle impermanence. So here, when we get to the level of the fourth meditative concentration, for example, in the form and the formless realms, again, you don't have any of these grosser kind of feelings, but are really in a neutral state of mind, and that neutrality can last eons and eons. But by thinking about impermanence in the sense of even subtle impermanence, we recognize as well that helps us to bring about an understanding that even that kind of samsaric abode is in the nature of suffering. And so thinking about this kind of subtle impermanence. Now, normally we think about more coarse kind of impermanence, things like recognizing that anything that comes together, the nature of that is that it will separate. And when things are accumulated, it is necessary that they will decline. And when we are born, it's necessary that we are going to die. So those kinds of levels of impermanence and understanding that are beneficial, but to get to the kind of point of renunciation toward all of samsara, including those really high kinds of meditative states, one needs to have had an understanding or a realization of subtle impermanence. Thus, this kind of order of ascertainment is important.
Oh yeah, that later Nyambe Shawan to Kondo Chibana, so tene la soba de rose, later Nyambe Shawan to Kondo Chibana, Keji Jure Chujere, Tia later Nyambe Wangi Nasaba Lake, Wangi Jure Chujere Dora, Tunga Dora, later Nyambe Shawan to Kondo Chibana, that's also you said the less of what you order, Semiorva. And the same Samutanda saw they were doing a share, and a Samutanda, and a Condodanga Geshe, Mabuchi order. What is a Ganga Kokaji Pan Gurua, Gure Suzanda, Toangame Combewange, the new Shawachangi, Pumbu Yimba, that there's some Corsona. Tanda you then get Pumbunga to Kokaji in Jibacha. Then going on me letting Yamumba Kandaji Payun and you under Kandata Gunet and Deji Shawacha de Dora. So Rawach and Kendram Dua. Tendeji Kondo Chesson and tell her round time about the she took it on Gora. So de Ramachika, so good and Semda Soa the Kanga, Language Shawache, Guiwange, Rawa Meban Jurachin Geshindua, Tinalia Soso de Tetan Delni de or Mado Teta Bekakasan, Tawa Dembachi Omara. Teson Jure Sujan, Kusangazudosa, Jisola Tawa Sigdua, Jigbe Ranshin, Tendechi Nalia, Tetan Wachibak Dachi or Mado Teta Best Loso, Rawa Taji Yonshin Yomar Tea. Kundu Chibala Pengide Sungora, Metabada Dunga de Samrutana, Tewangi, Rama Tamebatia, Kundu Chindu de Sungdua. Leda Yamu Beshawan do Kundu Chibana, Rama Kansaki Tamebaya Kundu Chiban Juros. Ragbe Metabada Dunga Tameba Sumji Kurimni Kondo Shebataros, teaching Medale Dunga, Kondo Shechar Shemoche. Oh, teach Chero. Tatunda, yeah, what is Kuna?
So then, when one sees that one is under the power of karma and defilements, one also understands that there is no independent person. So when we are able to come to an understanding that our body and mind, this kind of collection, these aggregates, are disintegrating moment to moment, and by realizing that kind of subtle impermanence, and not just their subtle impermanence, that they aren't remaining for even a moment, but we have this view of this perishable collection as though there were some kind of real actual self. But when we examine, both by looking at the impermanence in terms of being disintegrating moment to moment, as well as the fact that one is under the control of karma and the afflictions, we don't have the freedom, the autonomy to choose where we are going to be thrown, but rather we are propelled by the control of our previous actions. So when we begin then to see that this such a self is a impermanent, and B is under the control of karma and the afflictions, when one then can realize, can recognize that there is no autonomous self within those aggregates. There's nowhere else to point apart from our body and mind to find such a self. And when we look at again the object of the view of the perishable collection, that we can't find any sort of such self. Looking through our body and our mind and our feelings and so forth, one then can come to understand that there is no independent person. So thus the ordering of rough impermanence, suffering, and no self is thus comprehensible. So by understanding the kind of nature of the body and mind, the aggregates, as being impermanent and being under the control of karma and afflictions, those realizations help to bring forth an understanding of selflessness, as in there isn't an autonomous kind of person in control of those.
Oh, yeah. Tatundako, Neda, Luda, Longela, Sobakanga, Leda, Yamube, Shawacha, Reko, Karkar, Unitende, Yomardo. Tindeko, Tende, Comshedu, calling Inju Chigora, calling Inju. That calling Inju came at Tuna, so you nearly Longula Sobal Kazil, Shenja Chung Yunaya, to the trend at the Tadima Chiri, and Tasho Sarva, to do Dungachung Yunguade, Chendili Shashaginaya. Kazene Lulonjula Soboko, the Ineshada, Shenja Chimbuchidana, and a thing you read Tasho Sarako. And do I do anything I should say Yangura, Teleshuk Yangura. Tell some be Shenja Chimbuman, tell the trainer, Tungisha Chun do, tell some be a Kebayorno, call a paying Evanjuma Tunaya. Kazeko Chendi Mesike to the Nelly Lonjula Soba, go to tell some be in some Sadashi. Teach it on a college to step in. Torture what I sheboji to 10 to 10 10 to 10 Medera Kunarashana, and it's Tadimadi Kanga question. And it took me my young girl, I tell I think you are the Tunga children. Yeah, 10 to the teacher.
So, as much as we are able to understand that our abode, our body, our enjoyments and possessions are under the control of karma and the afflictions, all of these arise due to that power, and they are also thus impermanent, not remaining for even a moment. And so, even if we are not able to have a full kind of understanding of, say, subtle selflessness or subtle impermanence or the selflessness of things, having this understanding is going to help reduce our suffering, just recognizing that things are impermanent. is able to reduce our desire, our grasping for those kinds of things. So we need to have enough to say sustain ourselves. But if we have a really strong attachment to things and see them as being permanent and stable, when we then lose those, we're going to experience a great deal of suffering. So all of the various if all of our efforts are directed at just getting things for this life, and we have this kind of trust in them, we are going to experience more suffering. Whereas if we can let this understanding of impermanence reduce our kind of desire for those things, even in this life, we'll experience less suffering.
Oh yeah. That's somebody do. Tanzim Maban Bar Tagiola Charge Missibe, then two at the Redo, Tanamban de Banashirwa. Tanzim Maban Bardo Dagiola Charge Sigma Rese, and a call called the race on Giorno. Tanda Condo Shade, Chitabada Tunica Soda. Oh, Tanzim Batazuke, Tanzim. Pang Mogo Shisha, Ta Yubangazulo, Langi, Samjunashi, Rawa Yubache, and it Dagiwa Yuba Shisha, so I don't need to me, Yungu, but the comshed, Telami, Sari Sheswa, or T. Pingimariseta, Nambachena. Tanzi Maban Bar Dagiola Chate Missibe, Tonda Sutution and did Ese, Tundu the Shegua. True Tasha, Sebadan Demberta, Tala. Sakbadan Trawa Mimbe Church. Tandi Treta Susan Sigua. Treta Dangunation de Transembada, Conzugutan de Treta Shagdua, or Tissura Treta Hirazu call it Church and Segata de Susan. Sebadan Dembertase, Seba Yores, Chagba Yores, Cousin Tala Chagbadan Mother, Tala Chagbadua, Tala Rawa. Taxi Ramaji Zimba Ranja to one Zimba, Tiyurva, and then I say, Ting, I ever the order. Said, Sebadan Demberta, Kirang Dube, Treta, the Church, Sebadan Demberta, Tagula, Chakbata Tawami Becher. Sebadan Dembain Bandosana, no Landorgi, Legi, Zombacula Temberta. Lando Koya, Trubeta, Mekoya, Mabasuat, Titondalia, Lagacenico, Namdunation Besusiade, Tegris Gorno. Lando de Legi, Zombacula Tembertas. That's how Bango on the Koya and Mekoya, Toreta, Koya, Truetondalia, and in Besusia, less about the Tegris or Zombacula Temberta. Dosana, Nyomombada Lele Troa, Maimbertas, and Yomola Tremedua. Yamogo Chagdan wants on the Le Sagdua. Simply some tango to Ludanga Kana Geshe to Lujulam Jacoju Kangachi or Lesa de Yora. Yumumba Lele to a Maimbarta. Devangama Niji Chirsa. Or Devangama Niji Karsene. Tala Chagba the Trawa Membe Chirsa. Sebadan Demberta, Tala Chagba the Trevacher. Donase Sebadan Demba Inse Machichera. And the word de la Landorji Zombacun la Tembersas. Ta Condo. Sebadan Dembada, Landorji Zombacun la Tembayina Sigora. Tene, Debangamani, and Yamobada Leletro Mares, Debangamani di Teredua. Sebadan Dembada, and the Casa Landorji Zoada, Zoacun la Tembatinite. Gana. Tendra Koa Bashecha in the Koa Basigristilia, Chagdan de Shamadu June, Cosum de Lesan, Tedangeliani, Koa Basigurese. Tikana Truetati, when they throw him and do a Koa Bari to Duasa. Kibu Kanshi, Doba teacher, Tendra Koa Bashi Imberta, Kibu Kanshi, Doba teacher, Kansan Re, and the Chagdan go and get Cosum Jimbeg, Lea Sardavan Doba teachers. Telecoba Sigurs, a cancer in Bakanshi, and Chagdan doing Landur in the Subatilla, Suba in Bechina, Coaba or Tibadu Chiguna, Sawa de Yamdulashana, Sombacula Tembatesera, dire. Chagde mean the send that Kiran do it, but Chagda said, Chagde Mares, called Seba than Demba, Res Goda, Sendenda, Sombacula Tembatese. Bezugi, Tada Daginjini, Tombaculia, Koya di Tuya the Meguya say at Andala, some Lusuk Chambuchanico, take the Wasura. Namo Lele Trema, Tele, Namo Yode, less about the Yode Treatment was. Tende Kansa de la Coaba Siguresa. Tende Coaba show, what about Chiguna?
So then we turn to third, therefore, showing that it is, wait, sorry. Okay, sorry. So here we're at the third point, but it's saying that unless, if without abandoning self-grasping, it's impossible to be freed from attachment to mine. And so here in Roger's text, it's just listed as the summary point here. And so here it says it follows that the self that is freed has craving because it is not free from attachment to self. So again, the self as it is asserted, or the freed self as it is asserted by the Vaisheshikas and the Samkhyas and so forth, because they say that there is again, they have said that there's a way, a path that is a path to freedom based upon meditating on the suffering of that which is related to the self. So that would then induce a path to freedom. But according to them, the self as it is apprehended, such as self, and again, it's a freed self, because they would assert that, because we assert that when you have a view that there really is such a self, such a permanent, unitary, autonomous kind of a self, then so long as you have that kind of a self, you're not going to be free from attachment. That self will still have craving because it will still have the desire for that which is mine, and so forth. And as usual, we will continue to make efforts to get what we need for such a self and avoid what that self doesn't want. So if that is asserted, again, that this freed self still has craving because it is not free from attachment, it follows that the self depends on all karmic efforts at attainment and avoidance. And if that is asserted, it follows that that self is not free from the defilements and karma because of the two previous assertions. So again, when one still has an idea of I and mine, and therefore then is still craving what is useful or sort of beneficial to that I and mine, one is not going to be free from attachment and will continue to engage in all kinds of activities, karmic activities, make karmic efforts at getting those things that we want and avoiding those things that we don't want. And so in that way, that self is not free from the defilements and karma, because again, these two of the two previous assertions, that self that is freed has craving, and because again it depends on all karmic efforts. So it really isn't the case that such a self is freed, but is still a samsaric person, because so long as one has this grasping at an I, this idea of I, there is going to be craving for that, and attachment toward that I, and thus one will engage in various activities for the purpose of that I, toward the aims of that self and that mind. And so that kind of person, if the latter is asserted, it follows that such a self is called samsaric because that is the sort of person that has been asserted. So this self that they would assert to be freed is actually samsaric in that one still has that grasping at a self that leads to attachment and all of the various kinds of actions. So one who has craving is not free from attachment, depends on all efforts, and is not free from the defilements and karma. Such a being is called samsaric. So this is the response to that, the type of being that these other schools assert can be freed.
Oh, yeah. Taniba dirda, Niba Sina, Tre Ta Kelambala Kuba Meba said, Tandi subject in Gongo you can do Sara. Niba Tre Thabkhe langbala goba meba se chayige tadi karsi gorsana tangzi maba bar dage wala chakte misis tangzi maba na dage wala chakte misis nangba chenderwa tadu jimba maba bala tini dage wala chakba tawa sigma rese sina truwe Thabkhe langbala goba mebas tangzi maba bar dage wala chakba tawa sina rwa sina ene truwe Thabkhe langbala ko ene truwe Thabkhe langbala goba yama ko truwe Thabkhe regu mara tangzi yode yorwa o dirida niba sina truwe Thabkhe langbala goba mebas tangzi mabambar dage wala chakde misis tayo dosare sina se tangzi mabana ya dage wala chakba tawa sina ene truwe Thabkhe langbala goba mebanese te chochen se rwa truwe tadi chochen se gora kyöji du te se dage wa te sabo ya mebar ta se truwe ta toba te se kyöji du te se dage wa ye sabo ya mebar ta dage wala longcho babu ta de mebar ta se gora da ngaye se ngaye le longcho babu bra te kansa de mebar ta se gora truwe tadi chochen kyöji du na se truwe tu na te dage wa te sabo ya mebar ta longcho babu da mebar ta saja dage wa ni mende be chere dage wa te se mende be chere bra dena se te se daja mebar ta ane te se dage wa mena ta mebar ndo rese deba te se kebar ta se ta mena dage wa mebe kebgre se kebar ta takba chikbu tini kule che be chawa cha da debu longcho be sanyi che bar do be se kirangi ta takba chi yorwa o tira le sange de tire debu nyonge de tire cheba boda debu longcho be niga ta chikre de go yorwa le sange ki ta kora ran de chema debu nyondu te ran te de yorwa chikre de yorwa kyudan debu ni chikba so de cha de go yorwa o dan debu chen de meta di tsawa de dira dagi nyini mende na se truye se dagi wa me na se wada ni dagi wa longcho babu ta de yungu ma re se cha dan longcho chanyi chen tezi te ta ya me se tezi te ta ya me se chawa cheba dan longcho babu cha dan longcho chanyi chen se do cha dan longcho chanyi chen tezi te ta ya me se o te se kyöji tu te se se gora dagi wa sabo ya me ba ta saja dagi wa ni me de be se te ta ja me ba ta de be ke ba ta takba chikbu teni tu le cheba bo da si ta ma de cha da longju chenyi chen se de chawa chen da cheba bo da debu longju be chenyi chen be o ti chi do na chawa de nyam do
So here, then turning to the next point, it says, and this is following from what had come above, it says, if it is possible that one be detached from what pertains to the self without abandoning self grasping, the pointlessness of accepting that a self is freed. So again, if one is, as these certain schools are asserting, that one is able to get rid of grasping at that which pertains to the self or attachment to that which pertains to the self, while still asserting that there is such a self or they have self-grasping. So it follows then that at that time, there also is no experiencer of that which pertains to the self, because you do not assert that that which pertains to the self exists to be experienced. So again, if it were possible to remove the sort of grasping at that which belongs to the self or pertains to the self without getting rid of that sense of self grasping, then there wouldn't be any sort of object or thing that could be experienced. The object of that I would become non-existent. So there's so there's because you do not assert that that which pertains to the self exists to be experienced. if that is asserted, it follows that that self does not exist either because of that assertion. So if you have, if you're trying to assert that there is the self that is grasped, but yet you've gotten rid of grasping at that which pertains to it, then how could you have the self experience an object? And it follows that that reason pervades because that one permanent self is defined as the cause, the actor that creates karma, and the enjoyer of the result. So here again, this is linked to the idea that such a self again is a permanent kind of a self, and so this reason follows because again you have this problem that if you have a permanent self that creates the cause, creates a karma, and yet that permanent self is the same one that enjoys the result. That becomes a problem. You can't have a permanent self that exists in different conditions, such as being the actor and then the enjoyer of the result. And so it's only an impermanent kind of entity that could change. If you have such a permanent self, it's impossible to have that exist as the actor and the enjoyer. So the root verse of this then reads, at that time, there is no experiencer of that which pertains to the self, since you do not assert that that which pertains to the self. So there can't be an experiencer of that which pertains to the self if you do not assert that which pertains to the self. If that is the case, that self does not exist either, since the self is defined as the actor and enjoyer of what pertains to the self. So again, this is showing the kind of logical flaws that undermine that such a permanent self could exist, and that there could be such a self in the absence of grasping at what pertains to the self.
Oh yeah. That's sumbat tena. Tangzin pongo bar tembas. Ta ranglu doba shegdoa. Jita mabana, tangzin mabana, and it took mares, nambak to guerdo. Tenas, Juzen tenas, and then Jita pongo bar tembas, tishegdoa. That disugdoa. Joan doba ta, seven burnes. Tangone, coy dungele tower, do you none in the get solo, and he gets Tony and Bernie, any labu use gora. Tandangazutama, you get de Maris Kabas, Kachi Kabas to Tore Chigua. One is in a part to Lichigora, Kishigora. I genetic medutinate and reduce any two shet it and there is pa to Linchigora. Tiangone, Taba Tobe Tabka, one quality and Dugetan is Titogore. Teaching chili trochi or the pamper to go matter, never catch you a matter. Tesanga in the Kawachi, Chitembe Sabanashi, top down register give us to tender some tongo. Tedemaro, Paso Tilinche, the way to the Karin, Penjukanga, Shende Ora. This year, to the Pojo Devakarin at Taylor, Susan Devakarin at Taylor, Marginati Mara did some good to Sigurda. I think we need to not too much Gura. Maybe she thought that you said the Muslim never remember, thought that you never remember. She could out all to thinking we need to negate Silky or not. That's why she do that. So then the Kabachene, that you to the pump house, that you near us as Tennessee or Mary. Torn the Batas, one torn the garage in the Tuan Medugani, they should go your Marto, Namjina Sindrone Karichagnache, Karina Taptu Tete Gordo. Cambe Kalikali Rimbe, Nesong Tungele to Koya Dungele to and the Gashena, and it that up the red was by young talk by the Shaggy Kacherdo. Torn de Batache, Benes, Tabartoban Donase, Tungele Tendo Tarwashin Dugu Nase. Jisola Tawata, Zawanine, Yore Geshe, the young Rigbatas, Jigdade. Soso Pumbunga, Luda, some years at Denalis, Luda, some mini Kajikajin Yuda Yora. Tingarazo Tona Maja Mato Kundura de Hakura. Utan Godo, Kalasa Godo, Suton Godo, Chi, Namshi Lutugoda. Chindimanditun Namsa Sidu, Tinsan Nasa de Hakuda, Chi Unguel, Chi Una Chilemna, Kalekabusoda. So Nalo Naja to Kanga Lega Chaguri, Chi Jonga Lega Chaguri, and when Juracha do the Sogo, Sogo Juaja do an same the television Juacha. Sogo top the Juacha, some time to some chick and terror check Mudo. Oh, did Tabat Toban Denasa. Jisola Tawa Dasa, Jibber and Shinchangi, the Lucimi Nandeliane, Tatabaji Yonshin Yomardo. Tarawa Yonshin Yomara, Pumburawa Yomara, Sembrawa Yomara, Kechi, Kudu and Shamadu Kuni Rango to the Yora. Kuta Kangi Wanga led and Yamaba Rango to the till Rawasake Yomara, Yukorangi top the Karachan and teacher with the Mado, Susan Devanation to Yomato. Jisola Tawa da Sawan in the Yumar Geshe or Jigdade. Nanga Samsage, Nanzi Shukshambude. Tatil Tara Mambo Yordo to the Mawanga. Narawa Rangetuba Sera, Narangwina Tuba Sera. That took the Suzu Tara or Omatenju is not Tashu the Sigurdo. Tandangazu de Tumua, Namba Sangme Tumua Kelege. Rangetu Besavitasi. Pumbule loss of Tahi Batabuchi. So would assembly loss of Tahi Batabu, some Shuksambustua. Rawashi. And then I say some Lushukchambura. Or the map so the thing map masona. Tagi map masona, Tagi some Lushukchambura, Tagi Shuksambuna, Tagi or Coco to be at Amego to say it on the Chagdanko. Nagilem do Yorno. Tarbatoban Dona, Jisola Tower, the Sawan in a young Geshe, the young Rigbatas, or the Rigbares or a Tabares. Karesna, Jigda Koya Tawa in Jisola Tawa Pumbunala Nga Rawa, Rangse to be Shuju and see. Tiwang and I say, Ngai Lutan, I just Ngai Tage, Tawa to be charging down, getting your hair charging to the map so that to be at the Sam Shuk and Bishuado. Oh, Chagdani. You are a Geshe, young Rigbatas. The map so good, a punk or a pound Rigbata. Jigda Koya Tawa in is a Koya Jews or the Jigda in Badu Tuchare. Kalimambu Jam Duguera Tamaga. Razu Kasuda. Send Deli Chashane. Send Del Tungeda Jigda Tungenibude. Send Del Caso Tonju Yogi Lay or Valera. Send Dele less and send Del in your order to do your order. Send Dele less and the Debu Kawashima in your order. Send Dele less and the Kawashima Shimanam so leg Debume or so. Take the Italian Rosa so send it down Zinda and to make you do some Jutruse. Tashemo Tadura. No, did you? Cavalesum. Jida Koya Zawa Yeshe, Tami to be Shirap de Muni to Trubishes. Jigda de Koya Zawa in Bade, Cindy Samlutanda, Yamo Yondanda, Jelly Trup to go at it. Tami to be Shirap de Jigda Gungani in Bade Rikwamabu Trubat. Trubatation. Jigda Chuja, Kumita, Mitumbe Joleswa Maide. Toma maybe Jujanga Rangi Rito Besable, Jigda Koran, Jumable and Kejugumara. Kewa Toma Mebananga and Kumshil Jani. This Sabi Pachality and any Titanda Yontayo, Esongora. Zawa de Indian Dolana. Tichi Trende Tome Be Jujari no Sabele. Shoyan Juzo Tawa, the Zawan in a Yor Kishi City. Teacher quality or the Batasura. Trende Tome Be. Jujari no Sabele. Dado Zimbabwe Toma maybe Jusangi Rigni Pacha Sabula Tani Jungura Jumil Jungu Maresura. Jusangi no Sabula Jome. Or Teta Jigdadi. Sawanapa Yungurese. Joyan Juso Tawa, that's our in a younger Geshe, the younger Rigde. Jida Koya Tawa in Batupse. And then Jide Nimbudula Tami Dobeshirab in Bakundu Troops in Beatrice. Or this kuna. Mamambura Shafa. Yeah.
So then we have So here, when it comes then to the next point, it's showing that it is necessary to abandon this self view. This is encouraging us to get rid of this view of the perishable collection, the view of the disintegrating aggregates that we have. So it begins, therefore, recall benevolently. So this is something that is done out of a sense of love, of wanting to benefit others. We can see these days there are times when people are able to discuss their views back and forth, and sometimes that turns into a kind of trying to refute the other's views. It becomes something about trying to win over the others. But this is not what is trying to be done here. We're not trying to call others out and say like you're wrong, you're stupid, you got it wrong, but rather this is for the benefit of others, just explaining this in the way that it accords with realities. So it's not something that is said in order to put others down or be like you lost in an argument, but it's done out of love. So we call benevolently, therefore you who desire freedom, if you desire to attain liberation, you should dig out from the very root the view of the self in the perishable composites. And so here, this is something where we are in stages able to come to an understanding that this view of the perishable is the root of samsara, and that the view of or the realization of selflessness is what acts as an antidote to this. But we begin by recognizing that our aggregates, this body and mind that we have, although we view them with a kind of sense that they are permanent, we can see quite easily that they are changeable, that they are subject to all kinds of causes and conditions. Our composites, our body and mind, don't just remain static. We have to breathe, we have to eat, we can be affected by all kinds of conditions. Our body is changing and we change. We can see from this pandemic in the world how much our bodies and minds can change due to conditions. And so recognizing that, coming to see that, we see that there is no such autonomous self, no self that is established by its own nature, that is somehow set up from its own side without depending on anything else, but rather we are under the control of karma and our afflictions. We can't just do what we want. We can't just accomplish our desired aims because we don't have that kind of autonomy. We are grasping at this I, and that grasping at a self causes us to engage in all kinds of other afflictions that in turn cause us to create karmas that are determining the kind of future experiences we will have. So this kind of self-grasping is variously described in the higher and lower philosophical schools, the most subtle of which is described by the prasangikas or the consequentialists. But even speaking from the perspective of this text, a common understanding of grasping at a self of persons as being a self-sufficient, substantially existent entity, when we have such a grasping, such a view of the perishable collection, we then are going to strive after the needs of that self, giving rise to attachment for things seen as beneficial and aversion toward those things that are seen as harmful. And so, so long as we are clinging to thinking that there is such an inherently existent I or self, then we're going to want to get things. We're going to want to accomplish the aims of that self. And so here, again, what has come before is to prove logically and also through our own experience that this view of the perishable is the root of all of our suffering within samsara. We can see that when we engage in certain actions, we experience results as a cause or as a result of those. So sometimes we will do an action and we will experience the results in this very life. Some will be experienced in the next life and some in many future lives after that. But the logic and the kind of reasoning that has come before is to directly establish that such a view, misperception of a self is the root of samsara. And when we are able to establish that logically that self cannot exist, that self as it appears to us in our innate kind of a mind, then we recognize that the only thing that can get rid of such a self view is the opposite to that. And once we've, so it says, it follows that it is reasonable to dig it out, to get rid of this, because the self view is the root of samsara. and because it is proven that the wisdom realizing no self is the direct antidote to that. So by logically establishing that self view is the root of samsara, and that the opposite, the actual antidote to that, is the view of selflessness, one understands that this is the kind of situation that we are in. And so when again it continues by saying the self view does not originate causelessly or from inappropriate causes, because it beginninglessly originates from the seeds of appropriate homogeneous causes. So again, we've established that this is the cause of samsara, this view of the perishable, and it doesn't come about capriciously or without any kind of cause, but we've established that it originates from those appropriate homogeneous causes. And so if you're able to cut that through applying the actual antidote, then one is able to extricate oneself from samsara. So the root verse then says, therefore, you who desire freedom, you should dig out from the very root the view of self in the perishable composites, which beginninglessly originates from the seeds of appropriate homogeneous causes.
Oh yeah. Taniba Wanju long some Telamdo Mirasudwa. Wanju Chamboge Rage Tanda Hindu took that to the killing order. Niba Wanju Kalungsam Wang Kosunane, Kanan Wang the Wang Kosunan, Teletan Straight over Sigurdo. Wanju Gewalungsam and it Telamdo Miron set it and just some you can shake the subject some door. Wanju ge talam wan guru shoga telam yimbe tupchi ka te telam yinsi je tube tupchi de ka tela neje che tami tokbe sirap telam do temba ralu ta te wangu te telam mares de tami tokbe sirap de telam res tu tenje sum ko ni shegwa ta tangbo wanju ge talam wan guru shoga telam yimbe tupchi ka badira Wangu Shoga de Tolam City Tubji Shevara, Tituji Dugumedus Paka Gdua. Lonely Shebe Choga some give Tor Mawaya, Tonde Yonson Gucci member Tals, Ralu Sigora, and Wanju Lonely, and Shebe Choga Wangi Choga some Tobalatene, and call it to Grace Mawatea, loaded on them but talk them Namju Chabachingina. Ko sem guchi mares tele sheba samgi ichi chigma do kyusen kuyo na tele sheba na shires ane yimbe kyusen dires ja ngo to shuti rigbe tukuyo no lonle shebe choga samgi tor mawa ya tokden yonson guchi memberta wongur gi choga samgi tor tembe lonne se wongur choga samgi ne tondogre se sumbe londe Rangi Chujet la Mitua Teta Bungobo Yimbala Chusemado. Corona le Shed, you get the Shebate, Yimba Chujet de la Mitua Yimba Chujet, and the Moy Nesula Ne Yuba. Tiliani Chusenshe Meduasigora. Rangi Chujet la Mitua Teta Bungobo Yimbe Chusen. Lule Shebana Shingone Yindi, Chusen de Dus Cheche, Moy Nesu the Timbe Chusenshe Meduasora. Chusen Maton Vessels. Nam nesa adan diri da kasore sawa de siwara loni tede ngwe yimbe se wanju ge wangu lona le tede ngwe yimbe she yuna ya siwara kuma to namla ne lonzam pini tupche me shebe tanda de te yimbe kyuse she me do aswara kyuse ma to namla ne lonzam pini to ra yamawa yonsun guche me lonzam ge ene Lunalia, one one of Natura and Samkhyas, this on the two good days, Tetam Shebade, and Namju than Dembe Mawabody, on some Gucci Mares. Luma Kumanton, Namla Nis and Nam says to a Nam said, one Jugi Choga to get a Sava Tesam and Bashanda, Mabuyogo, Regina Sheba, Gashon Mabuyogo, Regina Sheba Kangatembares. Shebes and the Shandala Chajuris Nam said the Manziri said, Shankimar. Onguji Chaka Samji Tambe Longi Rangi Sujet on la Mutual Titabi Nobu Yimbe Kusama Tonash. Namni Shayan Samba or Shaya Lula Sheba de Tambayin Bengeba Yomare, Tambayin, Tambayin Berigbe to Chikore Suara. Hajan Tawa Nese, Kerante Shebanashina, Hajan Tagdosa. Longdele Shebe, Na Sabula, Tabe Nugu Mejawatar, Chusala Michulo Shenase. Ori tayan ko chula gudwa long de la shebe nga sabu la tapsuna ani nyugo meje ba suche ori tezo tembandu cheza de la shebe shanda kanga tembare sam tende tugoro chochala michulo shenase wangu ani to do rese de milu arese michu are mandoro yin shenase ti chula ora tene Tadi sawa de lone de sasa lone de ngwe be tomato namla ne lozam kine tra ma yo so guchi mes o tiji to nangel mangdo sa.
So then next, we turn to a refutation of Theist-Ritualist soteriology. And so the first of these points is the unacceptability as a path to freedom, just the word of God, of some kind of authority that is asserted to be correct. So, first of these is refuting the attempt to prove that a ritual empowered by God as a path to liberation is, in fact, a path to freedom. And so this refers to those who would think, whatever sort of Hindu system or others, that any kind of ritual empowered by God can act as a path to liberation just by receiving some kind of anointment or some special empowerment in ritual that one could achieve liberation. And so for us, that's not an acceptable kind of proposition based upon reasoning. That doesn't accord with the way that things actually are. So the first of these points then comes in the commentary on the next page, where it says, this is again refuting the attempt to prove that a ritual empowerment by God as a path to liberation is in fact a path to freedom. So it follows that the statement that one is freed merely by a ritual explained by sacred authority does not at all satisfy the intelligent. Because we do not see any reason why the sacred authority that teaches that one is freed merely by a ritual empowered by God is such an entity that is not mistaken in its expressed meaning. So here, just saying, well, this is according to sacred authority, that does not satisfy the intelligent. It's not that one can just say that this is the way it is without using any reasoning or any kind of logic that accords with reality in order to establish that that is actually true. So here, again, in this part of it, it's saying that we do not see the reason why the sacred authority that teaches that one is freed merely by a ritual empowered by God is such an entity that it is not mistaken in its expressed meaning. So just because something is said in a sacred text, we can't assert that that is true without using any sort of logic or reasoning to establish the veracity of that. So the plural marker implies alternative objectors. So it's not just those that say believe in a particular deity or a ritual empowered by a deity, but also those that say like all of the Vedas are the true word of God. Other types of belief systems that would imply that because of an empowerment or a ritual, one could achieve a kind of liberation. So there are multiple sort of opponents in that way. And the extreme consequences then follow, where the opponent says, well, when the mantra explained by sacred authority affects a seed, the sprout is not generated. So we are not mistaken about our express meaning. So they say, well, our rituals do have the efficacy to say be able to affect a seed such that it's not able to produce a sprout. So therefore, because it can accomplish that, it must be true. Everything else in those ritual texts must be valid. So that's the kind of objection or the point that is made by the opponent that we will then respond to.
Oh yeah. Ta hajan tawa to chugdwa. Lungli sheba samgi sabu kaji tsulab swa. Lungli sheba nga sabu la tabi nyugu meje wa tar chushala michuwa yinse wangju ge wanggu lungu shu na ne kwa le tandu uri similwa yinse na se tatila hajan tawara. Sabu so ge nyugu meje be choga tongwe se wangju ge wanggu wa tomata kibu yansi to meje war Cheneba Maimbartars, one topsona, call it Jemikuba Cheneba Maimbata, Tedana Lula Timur Kubata, Mesek Basoja, Tor Tavichirus, Tatendena, Lula Shebazam Sena, Lula Timur Kuda Mesek Basochena, Yanko turned to reset and this as a yoimbra, wrote as a net Tor Tavichirosa. The Tawa de Carina, Sabin sort of Chogani, Kibu. Meke parne mese timar kuita mese so taja toar tacheros sabin so tu choganes sabin liane nga tamne tondo meke ba yong gudwase sabin so tu chogani dena tesonja wonju ge wangu we chogani choga topson choga wang topsona kibudene koale kigmarese ti tuk marese Chogani kibu meke par new means to never maise. Tetum negina hachan tagre, Timaru lula timaku ne mese was a chenaya, Joar Talse, Joar Tavechirus. What did you do now?
So that then expresses the kind of extreme consequences. If, as the opponent says, that someone could be liberated just by a ritual, and they give the example, well, we see that the sacred authority affects a seed such that a sprout is not generated. So our texts must have the power then to also be able to cut the continuum of taking rebirth. So here, the response to that is when we see that a ritual accomplishes the non-generation of a sprout by a seed, etc., it follows that it will not be able to affect the non-generation of further samsaric existences for a person directly affected by that ritual empowered by God. Because if that were the case, it would follow that one could be freed even through the body's anointment with sesame oil being burned by fire, etc. So here again, the opponent is trying to say that a ritual empowered by God, we can say that it does have the power to free somebody because it has the power to say prevent a seed from giving rise to a sprout. And if that is true, then the claim that it can liberate a being must also be true. But the response to that is, okay, well, you could see a direct case where a ritual accomplishes the non-generation of a sprout by a seed, but it's not the case that one can cause that kind of cutting the continuum of rebirth through that ritual empowered by God. Because if that were the case, it would follow that even through that one could be freed through doing these sort of physical rituals, like the body's anointment with sesame oil and being burned by fire, etc. So I don't know if I may have forgotten to read the root verse for the previous passage. So the statement that one is freed merely by sacred authority does not at all satisfy the intelligent. We do not see any reason why sacred authority is such an entity. A ritual accomplishes the non-generation of a sprout, etc. It will not be able to affect a person's non-generation of rebirth, because it would follow that one could be freed even through the body's anointment with sesame oil or being burned by fire, etc.
Oh, yeah. 20 minutes calling. Oh, this one. That station do Chinsi may same get the chamber. Sheba member task, Tanasi, Chinsi, China men not to there's a Chinsi Mambuta attended. Only take but on do race, trot of do rest and the share on bro. Station do Chinsi may same get the chamber. Sheba member ta, Chinsi may loot to Ngar sangar chiwada chi yang songa zamimbe chi jinsigi me trane ni lu chi kale rechone lu ngama jigo jibu ne jigo yang sona ta tikba ta arese o tende marese tikba se ko ya suje mare jigo jibu da yang dre yo marese semle ko be pakchanda nibarete ordo jinsigi jibu de lu chiwa ni chagaya mebar jo samje tikba sangar chiwa member ta lujen member che tiba de chense ta ne lu kale mabutre ni chema lu tambu kajen do ta chema lu yaur che do tiba da bar se on bra o tende tiba de kilo ya cha ne yaur do ta chir do yo mare se lujen member che sugjen mare se tiba de o de ju shana ti karshur de le so ngarchi wada chi yang chir ngarchi to sobu chi go chi bu yobade chi jinse mambutane me kale chonde ani sobu yang ro chimba de tikba chombar cheba mense di chi ni me gyurji di sobu kale trasan yang ro chimbaro chi go chi bu de me ba char ma do lujen tikba de lujen ma rese ani tikchi mense lujen tikba lujen ma be chena sukjen ma be lujen su sukjen se gora tu ma bu o tikchi me tikchi tu na
So, here then it continues. Likewise, it follows that mental vices are not destroyed by a fire of burnt offerings, because those who were heavy before will be later be lighter, because their bodies have been heated by the fire of burnt offerings. But it does not follow that merely through the lightening of this person making burnt offerings, the weight of vice is lightened too, because vice is non-physical. So here, someone might argue that through doing rituals empowered by some kind of deity, doing say many fire pujas, one is able to get rid of non-virtues, to lighten or get rid of one's karma, for example. But those kind of non-virtues or vices are not something that is physical. Rather, these are imprints that are laid down on our mental continuum. And thus, any sort of physical ritual doesn't have any kind of effect on the vices or those non virtues that we have accumulated. So, there's no way that we can affect the non virtues that are in our mind stream, those that have laid down imprints through those solely physical actions, like doing repeated fire offerings and so forth. Although you can say get the weight of your body down through doing this physical activity, it's not possible to lighten the weight of one's karma or vice, because that is non-physical. So it's not possible through doing these kinds of physical rituals empowered by God, that one is able to get rid of non-virtuous actions. So the root verse to this reads, those vices are not destroyed by such rituals, because those who were heavy before will later be lighter. But it is not the case that through the lightening of this body, vice will be lightened, because it is non physical. So we can make this effort to engage in rituals in order to try to get rid of our karma and so forth, but it's impossible to actually affect that, as those physical rituals are dealing with something that is non physical, our karmic imprint.
Oh yeah, thank you, but no church about some say. Long Zambi, Wang Zambi, but agree said the nature, some say do. Kalung Zambi, and see Chime, Gula Meneva. One Tomnaya, Joalaya, Judela Nugmedose. Telang of Jula Nugres, Lang of Tipaka. Kabalaya, Ralu never Pambashe. Tadam Buddha. Oh yeah, Tambo. Kalung Zambi, and see Chime, Jula Menevas. One toba yenaya, Kavalaya, Judela Nugmedose, Kavala, the Tugmares. Tungela Tower Jimbe Loxetan, Tungela Tower Jimbe Loxetaro. Telechon Tower Tom to Gesebadans. Tell it the Tower Tom to Sebada. Someone then be Semba Church. Oh, Tatunda. Oh, Tungela Tower Jimbe Loxeche. Telechon Tower Tom to Gesemba. Tower Toban de Besembe on the lake Kawasaya Yorno. What do you Semba to Sigora? Someone then be Semba Church. Tene Rangi Kula, Kunyebe Tobje, Cheba Teyan, Tese, Yansi, Chimera, Dor Mindur Tese. Oh, Tune, Sembade, Chujan, Kangi Gula, Kansa, Kangi Gula, Kenyebe Tobje, Cheba Te, Yansi Chimera, Dor Mindur Star, and Lushek Doa. Tadu Zimbata, any de Lesani, Simbe Lesani, oh, te. Kansa di Kunyebe Tobje, Chess, Tinyebe Tobje Chessona, Leder when you mong is so by led in Yebit of the Pachi and Mabsona, and Yansi Chimal do Marese. Kiki Wangi Membe Neso, and draw Kiwa Zimbersheba Caresana, no less on the lady Wangi, any Kiki Wangi, Legi Wangi Membe Neso, drawn them Kiwan Zimbersheba, Kiwali and detention you are Eswara. Oh, Tindu. Tame be kewa lokse tan chungden gi semba teda ni gi pendo ne ba yindes o da teacher ndrimata triswes men men dra kewa ye teacher dra o de tade sawa de chilapsana tagan de bosana kamera kegi wangi membe neso dra kewa zimbar chebe chestira semba yomo wangi semba te wangi ne dra quality grese Kerang tanda wang toba tege di le di kaatu medus gora lokshe tani telechon siba sembe wang dage mene droa kewa in droa mebe ne su kewa le di le gwa ge lingi ware sigora lokbar sheba chon tele tene ni yula chakbe wang ge gidi gile sa gyordo mene droa ani mebe ne su droa kewa ye tichir teche droa me gyurse teche le nyumu bwe wange le sakbati che ni di che tayin dire che se pa che suna ni dra kola kondo mares o dis kuna ndi bacha
So then again, it continues by expressing a kind of further rejection to this. And so it's going to be first showing that just sacred words cannot damage the cause of future rebirth, and then refuting the reply to that and disposing of the attempt to damage our refutation. So there's that back and forth. So first showing that just sacred words cannot damage the cause of future rebirth. So here, it isn't possible that through a ritual empowered by a deity, one is able to get rid of the fundamental cause to be cycling within samsara. So the commentary begins, the intention concomitant with the attached craving to obtain happiness that originates from the distorted apprehending suffering as happiness, when cut by the power of its antidote in some mind stream, will not lead to future rebirths, because it is by the compulsions of that intention that transmigrators affect grasping for birth in the lower abodes. So it is this intention, or that sort of mind, the mind, we have an afflicted intention that then creates karma, and it is due to that karma ripening along with that craving that one experiences this cycle of suffering in samsara. But when one is able to cut that by the power of its antidote, that will not lead to future rebirths, because it is by the compulsions of that intention that transmigrators affect grasping for birth in the lower abodes. So when one has applied the direct antidote such that one doesn't any longer have the fundamental causes, this intention that then when we intend towards things or we have attachment and aversion for them, we're then going to accumulate karma. And due to that kind of karma that is arising from this distorted intention, that is what is causing us to cycle in samsara. And so when an ordinary being is born, they are enabled to be assisted by that very intention concomitant with distorted cognition and craving, because birth originates from just that as its cause. So this intention, volition, this kind of mental activity is what is causing us to then accumulate karma and be cycling in samsara. And this is not something that can be affected or stopped by the force of a ritual. So even if one has achieved or has attained a kind of empowerment or done a special ritual, that being is still going to be a samsaric being because they haven't gotten rid of the fundamental cause. So here then the root verses read, an intention concomitant with craving originates from distorted cognition. When cut, it will not lead to rebirth because it is by the compulsion of that intention that transmigrators take birth in lower abodes. And then, so when one is born, one is enabled by that very intention because birth originates from just that.
노야 되지 말랍셔나 시다 케미도 타메바 겨와라 로세다 총대게 셈바데다 니지 펜도 네바 인데서 녀모고한게 셈벨레게 니 레사소나 되게 거기게 그래서거든 대단다 왕되게 정부미도 시거든 타메바 겨와 로세다 총대게 셈바데다 니지 펜도 네바 인데 대삼 교류 여발에 총회시 콜 겨와래 대삼게 녀모고한게 레사네 대삼게 겨와라게 그래서 Lejan Kurguba Mayanamsani, Kiran Le Goriseswa, the lady Gurkumarvese, Chutuati Gordo, or Sibarikiwala, Sembale Tension Bele Yoma, Sembatica, Le Sigorese, Le Gorese, Namuguangeni, Kevada Miguel Sola, Sembersinge, Samruton Jungengi, Shibatile, Le Sigores, Lejan Gurguba Mayanamsana, Sibarikiwala, Sembale Tension Bele Gomare, Sibakora de Le Resigora. The Tesamlan enjoy Serese, Kela Teta Ninu Yese, Yomombo Angeles and the Tesamla Tenene, call it Ken Ugresivara. The Samba Yenane Lego Marabasana, Samba de Rani Le Incher Kijunamba Mesa Saudi Shigua, Samba de Le Resigara, Incher Kijunamba Mesa. Loshida Sundange, Samba dan Sundange, Samba de Rani Yansi Chimarkive Le Imbecile. Semba deda rani le incheris yansi chima kejigi le semba dagare semba da le chibare sora da yiji le sena tendershira yiji kiju nyamba me se kera wan toba dege te semba dozo nyamba chigi medosi nyam chutuk medosi ora loshe da chonde ye semba deda rani yansi chima kewe gyoyin besir tena wange choga sam seba le towa mende one top some gibu sibari give kuchung say yamba maybe church or teach Kurshana any do so teshasha. Yeah.
So here again, it is when an ordinary being is born, they are enabled to be assisted by that very intention concomitant with distorted cognition and craving, because birth originates from just that as its cause. It is that kind of intention, that thought that originates, that is concomitant with this attached craving coming from distorted cognition that is the cause of samsara. And so the opponent then comes back and says, well, isn't karma also necessary as a cause of rebirth? You talk about karma and the afflictions. And the response then comes, it follows that for rebirth into samsaric existence, it is not necessary to have some karma objectively separate from that intention, because the intentions concomitant with distorted cognition and craving are themselves the karma that generates future rebirths. So that karma, that volition or intention is actually, that volition or intention is karma. You don't need to have something else that you can point to as being karma, because this that we sometimes refer to as mental karma, that intention or volition, that is something that is not affected by that ritual empowerment. And so because that still remains, and that is itself karma, it has the power to generate then future future rebirths. So, thus, just empowered rituals are not the path to freedom from samsaric existence, because just by obtaining that empowerment, a person does not in the least undermine the cause of birth into samsaric existence. So, as that ritual is not able to affect that intention that is concomitant with desire and this distorted kind of thinking, it's not possible that that ritual empowerment could undermine rebirth. So, again, it says in the root verse, because intentions are themselves karma, rituals that do not affect intention do not undermine the cause of rebirth.
Oh yeah, that is to share.
So we'll stop there for today. Thank you all.
Oh yeah. That's a new day, oh yeah.
And see you tomorrow.
Thank you very much, Geshe Thabkhe, and also Katrina,
Yeah.
reminding everyone that out of his great kindness, we'll have an additional day of teaching. So we don't end tomorrow, we end on Thursday. You will notice the website does not reflect that, but it will very soon.
Oh yeah. Well, bye-bye.